Picture this. You inherit your grandfather's dream cabin on a pristine lake, only to have your HOA president call the police on you for trespassing on your own property. What started as harassment turned into the legal battle of the century when I discovered what she was really hiding. By the time this story ends, an entire homeowners association would be banned from the lakefront they thought they owned. Millions of dollars would change hands, and the woman who tried to destroy my life would face federal charges. My name is Sarah, and this is how one phone call to the police exposed the biggest real estate fraud in our county's history. My grandfather's death hit me harder than I expected. We weren't just family, we were best friends. Every summer of my childhood was spent at his lakefront cabin in Pine Ridge, learning to fish, exploring the woods, and listening to his stories about buying that land back in 1962 when it was just wilderness. So, when his lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited the cabin, I felt like I'd been given a piece of heaven. After years of city life and corporate stress, this felt like a sign. I quit my job, packed my life into boxes, and drove the 12 hours to Pine Ridge to start fresh. The cabin sat on 2 acres of pristine lakefront property, with a private dock and the most beautiful view you've ever seen. But as I pulled into the gravel driveway that October morning, I noticed something wrong. The dock that had always been there was gone. In its place was a shiny new marina with a sign reading Pine Ridge HOA members only. I was still staring at it when a woman marched across my lawn like she owned the place. Margaret Whitmore, age 50-something, with the kind of perfectly styled hair that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager." She planted herself in front of my moving truck with her arms crossed. "Excuse me, you're trespassing on HOA property," she announced. "This lakefront area is restricted to Pine Ridge residents only." I blinked at her. "Ma'am, I am a Pine Ridge resident. I own this cabin." Her laugh was sharp and condescending. "Young lady, I'm the HOA president. I know every property owner here, and you are not one of them. This land has been part of our association for over 20 years. I felt my blood pressure rising. My grandfather, Harold Mitchell, owned this property for 60 years. I have the deed. Harold Mitchell never owned lakefront property, she said firmly. He had a landlocked cabin that we graciously allowed lake access to. But that arrangement died with him. The moving guys were standing there awkwardly, not sure whether to keep unloading. I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo of my grandfather and me on his dock from just 2 years ago. "That's our community dock," she said without missing a beat. "Your grandfather was confused in his final years. Happens to the elderly." The disrespect in her voice toward my grandfather made something snap inside me. "Lady, I don't know what your game is, but this is my property and that's my dock. Call the police then," she said with a smirk. "Let them sort it out." "Fine, I will. Don't bother," she said, already dialing. "I'm calling them now to report trespassing." I watched in disbelief as Margaret Whitmore called 911 and reported that I was illegally occupying HOA property and refusing to leave. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Deputy Collins arrived, looking tired and annoyed. "Ma'am, I need to see proof of ownership," he said to me. I handed him my grandfather's deed, dated 1962, clearly showing 2 acres, including lakefront access. Deputy Collins examined it carefully, then looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Whitmore, this deed appears legitimate." "Deputy Collins, I've been dealing with property disputes here for 20 years, Margaret said smoothly. "That deed doesn't include lakefront rights. The Mitchell property has always been landlocked. We have extensive documentation proving that HOA owns all lakefront access in this development." She handed him a thick folder of papers. The deputy looked overwhelmed. "Look, folks, this is a civil matter. I can't make a determination about property boundaries. You'll need to work this out between yourselves or through the courts." Margaret's smile was triumphant. "Of course, Deputy. We'll be filing for an injunction tomorrow to prevent further trespassing." After the deputy left, Margaret turned to me with cold eyes. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings and vacate this property. The HOA will be taking possession, pending legal resolution. That night, I sat in my grandfather's cabin surrounded by boxes, feeling completely lost. I'd used my entire savings to move here. And now, some HOA president was claiming my inheritance didn't exist. But as I went through my grandfather's papers, looking for anything that might help, I found something that made my heart race. A letter from 2019, from Margaret Whitmore herself, thanking my grandfather for his generous annual donation to maintain community lake access and confirming that his lakefront property rights would be honored in perpetuity. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse with the letter in my hand. But when I got there, I discovered something that changed everything. The woman at the deed office pulled up my property records and frowned at her screen. Ma'am, according to our records, your property was rezoned as landlocked residential in 2018. The lakefront portion was transferred to the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association through eminent domain proceeding. Eminent domain? For what purpose? She clicked through more screens. Environmental conservation. Says here the lakefront was deemed ecologically sensitive and transferred to the HOA for preservation. I stared at her, but there's a marina there. Now, I'm sorry, that's all the information I have. I walked out of that courthouse knowing something was very, very wrong. My grandfather never mentioned any eminent domain proceedings. He never mentioned losing his lakefront rights. And he definitely never mentioned paying the HOA annual fees to access his own property. That afternoon, I got the legal papers. Margaret Whitmore and the Pine Ridge HOA were suing me for trespassing, demanding I vacate the property immediately and pay $50,000 in damages for illegal occupation of association land. But the most shocking part was at the bottom of the lawsuit. They weren't just claiming the lakefront, they were claiming my entire 2-acre property, including the cabin itself. According to their filing, my grandfather had been illegally squatting on HOA land for decades, and his fake deed was a forgery. I had 24 hours to respond or face a default judgment that would cost me everything. I spent that first night, after receiving the lawsuit papers, crying on my grandfather's porch. Not just crying, sobbing like a child. Everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, about my grandfather's legacy, was being called into question. Part of me wondered if I should just walk away, cut my losses, and try to rebuild my life somewhere else. But by morning, something had hardened inside me. This wasn't just about property anymore. Margaret Whitmore had called my grandfather's deed a forgery and accused him of squatting. She'd essentially called him a liar and a thief. The man who taught me about integrity, who never took so much as a free coffee without paying it forward, was being posthumously accused of fraud. I wasn't going to let that stand. The problem was, I couldn't afford the kind of lawyer this case would need. My grandfather's estate had enough to cover basic legal fees. But going up against an established HOA with deep pockets required serious legal firepower. That's when I remembered something my grandfather used to say. Sometimes the best weapon against injustice is the truth. I started digging. My first stop was the Pine Ridge development records. If the HOA really owned all this land, there should be clear documentation going back decades. What I found instead was a maze of confusing transfers, rezoning applications, and paperwork that seemed deliberately complex. The Pine Ridge HOA was incorporated in 1995, 33 years after my grandfather bought his land. The original HOA boundaries clearly excluded lakefront properties, including my grandfather's. But in 2018, something changed. A series of rapid-fire amendments expanded the HOA boundaries to include all lakefront properties. In the area, the timing was suspicious. 2018 was the same year the county records showed my grandfather's property being rezoned. It was also the year my grandfather, at age 85, started showing early signs of the dementia that would eventually take him. I spent every waking hour at the county courthouse, the library, and online, building a timeline. What emerged was a pattern that made my stomach turn. Between 2018 and 2020, 5 different lakefront property owners in Pine Ridge had their properties rezoned for environmental protection and transferred to HOA control. All 5 owners were elderly. 3 had cognitive issues. 1 had died before the transfer was finalized. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. While researching property values, I discovered that immediately after these lakefront properties were transferred to the HOA, Margaret Whitmore's company, Whitmore Property Development, had been awarded the contract to manage and develop the newly acquired HOA lands. The same woman who claimed to be protecting the environment had built a private marina, a boat rental business, and was planning luxury lakefront condos on land that had been seized under false environmental pretenses. I printed everything and drove to the office of David Chen, the only lawyer in town I could afford for an initial consultation. David was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a small practice that specialized in property law. When I laid out everything I'd found, his expression grew darker and darker. "Sir, this isn't just a property dispute," he said quietly. "This looks like organized fraud, possibly racketeering. Can we prove it? Maybe. But we need more than circumstantial evidence. We need something that shows intent to defraud." He paused. "And we need to be very careful. If you're right about this, we're not just going up against a neighborhood horror. We're challenging an organized scheme that's stolen millions of dollars in property." That weekend, I got my break. I was going through more of my grandfather's papers when I found his old cell phone in a kitchen drawer. It was an ancient flip phone that he'd kept for emergencies only. On a whim, I charged it up. The phone still worked, and it still had voicemails, dozens of them, going back years. Most were from doctors, family members, me calling to check on him. But starting in 2018, there were messages from Margaret Whitmore. My hand shook as I listened to them. Double quotes, "Harold, this is Margaret from the HOA. I know this is confusing, but the county needs you to sign these papers about your property. It's just a formality to keep everything legal. Call me back, Harold. You need to sign these documents today, or you could face serious legal consequences. I'm trying to help you here, Harold. If you don't cooperate with this process, you could lose your cabin entirely. Sign the papers and everything will stay exactly the same." The last voicemail was dated 3 weeks before my grandfather's death. "Harold, stop being difficult. You've already signed the transfer documents. The lakefront belongs to the HOA now. If you keep fighting this, I'll make sure you lose everything." I played that message 5 times, my anger growing with each repetition. This woman had terrorized my dying grandfather, manipulated him into signing away his property, and then threatened him when he tried to resist. But the real breakthrough came when I realized something about those transfer documents she'd mentioned. If my grandfather had signed papers transferring his lakefront property, those documents had to be filed with the county, and if I could find them, I might be able to prove they were obtained through fraud or duress. It took 3 days of searching through county files, but I found them. Property transfer documents signed by my grandfather in April 2019, 3 months after his dementia diagnosis. The signature looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like his usual confident handwriting. But more importantly, the documents included a notarization by someone named Jennifer Walsh. According to county records, Jennifer Walsh was Margaret Whitmore's daughter-in-law and a notary public. She'd notarized the documents from an address that was Margaret's home office. I had evidence that an elderly man with documented cognitive impairment had been pressured into signing away valuable property, with the notarization handled by a family member of the person who benefited from the transfer. Any first-year law student could see the problems with that. David Chen's eyes lit up when I showed him what I'd found. "Sir, this changes everything. We're not just defending your property anymore. We're going on the offense." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather's final months. how confused he'd become, how he'd sometimes forget where he was or what year it was. The idea that Margaret Whitmore had taken advantage of his condition, had bullied and manipulated him when he was at his most vulnerable, filled me with a rage I'd never felt before. But I also felt something else, determination. My grandfather had always taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The next morning, David filed our response to the HOAS lawsuit. But we didn't just deny their claims, we countersued Margaret Whitmore, the Pine Ridge HOA, and Whitmore Property Development for fraud, elder abuse, racketeering, and theft. We demanded not just the return of my property, but damages for all the other elderly residents who've been victimized by this scheme. The day our countersuit was filed, my phone rang. It was Margaret Whitmore, and she was furious. "You little bitch," she hissed into the phone. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I'll destroy you. I'll make sure you never see a penny of that property." I smiled as I hit the record button on my phone app. "Please, go on. I'm recording this conversation." The line went dead. 3 days later, I got a call from David. "Sir, you need to sit down for this. The FBI just called. They want to meet with us tomorrow." The FBI meeting changed everything. Special Agent Rodriguez had been investigating real estate fraud in rural counties for 2 years. And our case had landed on her radar when David filed our countersuit. What she told us made my head spin. "Ms. Mitchell, your grandfather wasn't Margaret Whitmore's only victim. We've identified at least 12 elderly property owners across 3 counties who've lost lakefront property through similar schemes. We estimate the total fraud at over $15 million. Agent Rodriguez explained that they'd been building a federal case, but needed more evidence. Our lawsuit, with its documentation of phone calls, fraudulent transfers, and elder abuse, was exactly what they needed to move forward. "We want to coordinate with your civil case," she said. "If you're willing to work with us, we can provide federal resources and protection. But I need to warn you, this is going to get ugly. When people are stealing millions of dollars, they don't give up easily." She was right. The next 3 months were the hardest of my life. First came the intimidation tactics. Strange cars parked outside my cabin at night. Anonymous phone calls at 3 a.m. with no one on the line. My mailbox was vandalized twice. Someone threw a brick through my front window with a note attached: "Leave now or face the consequences." But the legal harassment was worse. Margaret Whitmore's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to get our case dismissed, trying to block our access to evidence, trying to force me to pay their legal fees. Every week brought new paperwork, new court appearances, new attempts to drain our resources and break our will. The local community was split. Some neighbors supported me, remembering my grandfather fondly and suspecting something wasn't right about the HOAS claims, but others, especially HOA members who benefited from the marina and lakefront access, treated me like a troublemaker trying to destroy their community. The breaking point came in January when we received Margaret's deposition testimony. Under oath, she maintained her story. My grandfather's deed was fake. He'd never owned lakefront property, and she was just protecting the community from a fraudulent claim. But during cross-examination, David caught her in several lies. She claimed she'd never had personal conversations with my grandfather, but we had the voicemails. She claimed the property transfers were handled by county officials, but we had evidence she'd personally collected the signed documents. Most damning, she claimed her company had no financial interest in the seized properties, but we had contracts showing Whitmore Property Development earning hundreds of thousands in management fees. Still, depositions aren't trials. Margaret was polished, prepared, and had expensive lawyers coaching her through every answer. We needed something more. That's when Agent Rodriguez called with news that would change everything. "We got it," she said simply. "We flipped Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's daughter-in-law, the notary who'd handled the fraudulent property transfers, had agreed to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for immunity. She'd been keeping records of everything, including recorded conversations with Margaret planning the fraud scheme. The trial began on a cold March morning. The courtroom was packed not just with lawyers and parties, but with reporters, FBI agents, and dozens of community members. Word had spread about the federal investigation, and everyone wanted to see how it would play out. Judge Harrison was a stern woman in her 60s who clearly done her homework. She'd read every filing, every piece of evidence, and her opening remarks made it clear she understood the stakes. This case involves serious allegations of fraud, elder abuse, and organized criminal activity. She said, "I expect all parties to present their evidence clearly and completely. This court will not tolerate any attempts to obstruct justice or intimidate witnesses." Margaret's lawyer, a slick corporate attorney named Richardson, opened with the same story they'd been telling for months. "My grandfather was confused. His deed was questionable, and the HOA was just protecting community interests. He painted me as a grieving granddaughter who couldn't accept reality." But when David stood up for our opening statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He laid out the evidence methodically, the timeline of seizures targeting elderly residents, the financial benefits flowing to Margaret's company, the intimidation tactics used against vulnerable victims. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David said in closing, "this is not a property dispute. This is a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted elderly residents, stole their property through fraud and coercion, and then threatened anyone who tried to expose the truth. The defendant didn't just steal Sarah Mitchell's inheritance, she terrorized her grandfather in his final months, and then tried to cover it up." The first week of testimony was brutal. Margaret's lawyers brought in expert witnesses challenging the validity of my grandfather's deed, county officials testifying about proper rezoning procedures, and HOA members claiming they'd never seen my grandfather use the lakefront property. But then it was our turn. Jennifer Walsh took the stand on Monday morning of the second week, and you could feel the tension in the courtroom, pale and nervous. She spoke barely above a whisper as David walked her through her testimony. "Mrs. Walsh, did you notarize property transfer documents signed by Harold Mitchell in April 2019? "Yes." "Where did this notarization take place?" "At my mother-in-law's house." "Margaret's house. Was Mr. Mitchell present during the signing?" Jennifer's voice broke. "He was there." "But he was confused. He kept asking why he was signing papers, what they were for." Margaret kept telling him it was just a formality, that nothing would change. "Did you believe Mr. Mitchell understood what he was signing?" A long pause. "No. I told Margaret we shouldn't proceed. But she said if I didn't notarize the documents, she'd make sure my husband lost his job at her company." The courtroom erupted. Margaret's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Jennifer Walsh had just testified under oath that the property transfer was obtained through fraud and coercion. But the bombshell came when Agent Rodriguez took the stand. She'd been granted special permission to present evidence from the ongoing federal investigation, and what she revealed left the courtroom stunned. "We have recorded conversations between Mrs. Whitmore and associates discussing plans to target elderly property owners with cognitive impairments," Agent Rodriguez testified. In one conversation, dated March 2019, Mrs. Whitmore specifically mentions Harold Mitchell as an easy target because of his dementia diagnosis. She played the recording for the jury. Margaret's voice, clear and cold. "The old man won't remember what he signed anyway. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll own the whole lakefront." I watched Margaret's face as her own words filled the courtroom. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked scared. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Agent Rodriguez continued with evidence of similar schemes targeting 11 other elderly residents. Financial records showing millions of dollars in fraudulent property transfers, and communications between Margaret and county officials who'd been bribed to expedite the rezoning processes. This was not an isolated incident. Agent Rodriguez concluded. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated for over 4 years and victimized dozens of families. And Friday afternoon, after 2 weeks of testimony, both sides gave their closing arguments. Margaret's lawyer made a desperate attempt to portray his client as a dedicated community volunteer who'd made some mistakes, but never intended harm. David's closing was quiet, but devastating. He played the voicemail where Margaret threatened my grandfather, showed photos of the luxury marina built on stolen land, and reminded the jury of Jennifer Walsh's testimony about the fraudulent notarization. Harold Mitchell trusted his community. David said he trusted that when his HOA president called him about paperwork, she was trying to help him. Instead, Margaret Whitmore saw an elderly man with dementia as an opportunity for profit. She didn't just steal his property, she stole his dignity, his peace of mind, and his granddaughter's inheritance. The evidence is clear. This was fraud. Plain and simple. As the jury filed out to deliberate, I felt a strange calm settle over me. We'd presented everything we had. The evidence was overwhelming. But juries can be unpredictable, and Margaret's lawyers were skilled at creating doubt. The wait began 6 hours later at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. The bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. My heart pounded as we filed back into the courtroom. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of controlled panic. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood to deliver the verdict. The courtroom was dead silent in the matter of Mitchell versus Whitmore and Pine Ridge HOA. On the count of fraudulent property transfer, we find in favor of the plaintiff. I stopped listening after those words. We'd won. But as the foreman continued reading the verdict, I realized we'd done more than just win. We'd exposed everything. The jury awarded not just the return of my property, but $2.3 million in damages. They found Margaret personally liable for elder abuse, fraud, and racketeering. The entire Pine Ridge HOA was ordered dissolved, and all property seized through fraudulent transfers was to be returned to the rightful owners or their heirs. But the real shock came when Judge Harrison announced her additional ruling. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom as she prepared to announce her supplemental ruling. The jury had already delivered their devastating verdict against Margaret Whitmore. But something in the judge's expression told me this wasn't over. Before we conclude these proceedings, Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying the weight of authority. I must address additional evidence that has come to light during this trial. Evidence that goes beyond the scope of this civil case, but demands immediate action. She turned to Margaret, who sat frozen at the defendant's table. Mrs. Whitmore, the testimony and evidence presented here have revealed a pattern of criminal behavior that extends far beyond property fraud. Based on the recorded conversations presented by the FBI, your own admissions under oath, and the testimony of multiple witnesses, I am ordering an immediate criminal contempt citation and directing the district attorney to file formal charges. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, the evidence clearly shows that the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association was used as a vehicle for criminal enterprise. Therefore, I am issuing an immediate injunction dissolving the association and banning all current board members from forming any similar organization for a period of 10 years. I felt David's hand squeeze my shoulder, but I was still processing what this meant. Margaret's face had gone completely white. Finally, the judge continued, regarding the lakefront properties in question, this court finds that all seizures conducted under the guise of environmental protection were fraudulent. The lakefront area is hereby returned to its original property, owners, or their legal heirs, effective immediately. Any structures built by the HOA on seized property must be removed within 90 days unless purchased by the rightful property owners at fair market value. The gavel fell one final time. We'd won everything. But the real twist was yet to come. As we walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, Agent Rodriguez approached me with an expression I couldn't read. Sarah, we need to talk privately. There's something else. 20 minutes later. In David's office, Agent Rodriguez dropped a bombshell that changed everything I thought I knew about this case. Margaret Whitmore wasn't the mastermind. She said simply, she was a front for something much bigger. She opened a thick file folder and spread photos across David's desk. Bank records, property transfers, corporate filings or paper trail that painted a picture I never could have imagined. For the past 18 months, we've been investigating a multi-state real estate fraud ring. They target rural lakefront properties, using local accomplices to identify vulnerable elderly owners and execute property seizures. Margaret was just one operator in a network that spans 12 states. I stared at the documents. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate, $80 million in stolen property over the past 5 years. David leaned forward. What does this mean for Sarah's case? It means she's about to become very wealthy. Agent Rodriguez smiled. Federal racketeering laws allow for triple damages when prosecuting criminal enterprises. Plus, there's a victim compensation fund that's been established with seized assets from other operations. She pulled out another document. Sarah, based on your case being the breakthrough that exposed this entire network, you're eligible for a whistleblower reward of $2.5 million from the federal government. I felt dizzy. This is insane. It gets better. Agent Rodriguez continued. The investigation your lawsuit triggered has led to indictments in 6 other states. 43 people have been arrested, including 2 county commissioners, a state legislator, and the CEO of a major property development company. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. There's one more thing, Agent Rodriguez said, pulling out a final document. When we seized assets from the criminal network, we found something that belongs to you. She handed me a property deed, not for my grandfather's cabin, but for something I'd never heard of, the Harold Mitchell Memorial Wildlife Preserve. What is this? Your grandfather apparently donated 500 acres of undeveloped woodland to create a nature preserve. About 10 years ago, it was supposed to be managed by the county, but somehow Margaret's organization took control of it. The land is worth approximately $4 million. I stared at the deed with my grandfather's signature, his real signature, strong and confident. He never told me about this, according to the paperwork. He wanted it to be a surprise for you after he passed. A way to ensure the land would always be protected and would provide income for future generations through conservation leases. The room spun around me. In the span of 6 months, I'd gone from losing everything to inheriting property worth millions of dollars and exposing a criminal conspiracy that stretched across multiple states. But more than the money, I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me in those final months when his mind was failing. The confused phone calls about bad people trying to take his land. The scattered references to important papers he'd hidden. He'd been trying to warn me about Margaret and protect the legacy he'd built. 3 months later, I stood on the dock of my grandfather's lake cabin, now watching the sunrise paint the water gold. The HOA marina had been demolished, the lakefront restored to its natural state. The other elderly victims had their properties returned, and several chose to sell to the new Harold Mitchell Memorial Fund I'd established to protect lakefront property from future development. Margaret Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The judge noted that her targeting of elderly victims with dementia was particularly heinous and warranted the maximum sentence. She was also ordered to pay $8.7 million in restitution to her victims. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a letter from Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's former daughter-in-law, who testified against her. She divorced Margaret's son and moved across the country with her children. But she wanted me to know how grateful she was that someone had finally stopped Margaret's reign of terror. You saved so many families, she wrote, including mine. I watched a family of ducks paddle past my dock. I thought about my grandfather and what he would have made of all this. He'd always said that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. He'd also said that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to continue their fight for justice. I'd done both. The Harold Mitchell Memorial Wildlife Preserve now protects over 2,000 acres of pristine wilderness, funded by the settlement money and managed by a board of environmental scientists and community members. Every year, it provides nature education programs for hundreds of local kids who'll grow up understanding that some things are more valuable than money. My new career. I use my settlement money to help elderly families fight property fraud. Working with David, who's now my partner in both law and life, we've helped over 50 families recover stolen property and put dozens of scam artists behind bars. Margaret Whitmore thought she could steal from a defenseless old man and intimidate his granddaughter into silence. Instead, she exposed a criminal network that had been operating for years and ended up losing everything she'd built through fraud and intimidation. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes, it's worth the wait. And every morning when I sit on my grandfather's porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the lake he protected for 60 years, I remember his favorite saying, "The truth has a way of floating to the surface, just like a good piece of wood." He was right about that. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know, if you're dealing with property fraud, elder abuse, or any situation where someone with power is taking advantage of vulnerable people, don't give up, document everything, seek legal help, and remember that sometimes one person standing up for what's right can bring down an entire criminal conspiracy. The truth always finds a way to surface. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to dive deep and bring it up.